it occurred to me listening to the previous three speakers that if believing things that aren't true were a virus, then they would all be emeritus professors of virology, whereas I would be a nurse or perhaps a GP seeking to deal with the symptoms. And in my last book, I kind of sought to explore why people end up believing things that are demonstrably false. And bizarrely, it didn't change the world. I mean, Brexit is still happening. Donald Trump is currently at 5 to 8 this evening, the president of the United States of America. Perhaps more pertinently, as Sarah so brilliantly portrayed, he has also secured millions and millions of votes, more votes than he secured last time. So it's possible that my rather conceitedly titled book, How to Be Right, didn't actually change the world. So when the opportunity came along to write another book, I realized that writing How to Be Righter would be insufferably smug and possibly dangerous. And writing a book called I Told You So would equally not really change any minds that needed to be changed. So if we carry on this rather tortured medical analogy, I suppose the idea I came up with was physician heal thyself. So if I could identify thoughts, opinions, positions, even perhaps beliefs that I hold or held that were demonstrably hurtful to other people and therefore possibly dangerous and probably wrong. And if I could work out not only how I arrived at them, but why I clung to them, then possibly that would be quite a helpful exercise in the context of what John and Naomi and Sarah have been talking about this evening. And it coincided with some fairly epic events in my private life, in my personal life. So I had spent all of my adult life thinking that attack is the best form of defense. And obviously I'm not talking about physical fighting. I'm talking about verbal fighting in my case. My entire career, really, certainly the kind of renown that allows me to sit here this evening in such esteemed company is built almost entirely upon my ability to sort of pull people's pants down live on the radio, on my radio show. And while that is a great spectator sport, I'm not, as I get older, I worry increasingly about how substantive and how effective it actually is. So I thought if I can look at what has led me to be wrong, I'll be making progress. And then this personal catastrophe occurred, whereby this what I thought was skin turned out to be armor. So I came to a personal family crisis, a medical crisis. Someone I love very deeply got very, very ill, and it turned out I wasn't helping. To my shock and my horror, all of the challenges I'd faced in my life previously had been overcomable by being aggressive, by being belligerent, by cajoling and by, sort of boosting. And on this occasion, the most important challenge I'd ever faced in my life, I wasn't just failing, I was making things worse, because you can't argue or debate or even sort of encourage somebody out of illness. And so in a spirit more of desperation than expectation, I decided to go for psychotherapy. And I went, skepticism doesn't even come close. I turned up in full expectation of either laughing my socks off or marching out of the first session in a state of high dudgeon. And I got that horribly wrong, because within sort of half an hour of sitting down with this therapist, it became increasingly clear that my own personality, what I thought was my authentic personality, had in fact started to be constructed in my childhood. And so at the age of 10 at an English prep school, I began to be regularly beaten formally and officially by my headmaster. There was plenty of casual violence that went on in the corners, but this was formal violence. This was where you would queue up outside the headmaster's study and wait to be thrashed by a fully grown man. I was 10, who possessed a specially designed paddle for the business of brutalizing small boys. And my therapist said to me, what did that make you feel? And I said to her, I said, it made me feel great because I was a hero. You know, I was the boy in the school who got beaten the most. It didn't do me any harm, didn't hurt me at all. I absolutely thrived on it. And I still have a reputation among my peers from that era for being, you know, a combination of Malcolm McDowell in If or Just William. And she just looked at me. She didn't say much. And she just said, really, it didn't hurt. And something shifted inside me that had been there for over, you know, 30 years. And I sort of said, well, yeah, actually, it really did hurt. And that turned out, as the therapy continued, to be the point at which I had really dedicated epic amounts of my life to persuading myself that I hadn't been harmed or hurt in any way by deeply unpleasant and deeply painful experiences. So the first bit of the book began to take shape in the sense of I would appear on television to defend corporal punishment. I would be in favor of more or less indiscriminate stop and search on the grounds that if you had nothing to hide, you had nothing to fear. The stiff upper lip combination with the insistence that it didn't do me any harm. And I began to realize that my failure to look after my loved one actually went right back to sort of 1982, as opposed to going back to the beginning of the illness. So that was the first building block of the book. The second was the one that my publisher was expecting me to write before I started going all deep and therapeutic about it, which would just be a long list of things that I'd got wrong and other people had got wrong. So I'd spoken to Malcolm Gladwell, I spoke to Akala, I'd spoken to George the poet, lots of other people who were helping me see perhaps the error of my ways, and in Gladwell's case, identifying things that he'd been wrong about and talking about why he found the admission of wrongness liberating and rejuvenating, actually. And that was the second part of the book that I was going to write. And then the third part began to emerge when Boris Johnson caught coronavirus, because I had just had it. And I had realized pretty quickly, possibly as a result of the therapeutic process, I'll never know, but I'd realized pretty quickly that like my loved one's illness, this virus was not something you could argue or fight or battle or kind of, you know, belligerent your way out of. And so I lay flat on my back for 8 days and lost a stone and got better quite quickly. And then David Cameron popped up in a thankfully rare public appearance these days. David Cameron popped up and said, I'm absolutely confident that Boris Johnson will be able to beat this virus because I've seen how he plays tennis. And I felt a bit sick when I heard that for two reasons. The first was that I recognized almost immediately myself. That was precisely the position I would have adopted before I sought therapy. And the second was it could kill him. It could kill Boris Johnson, for whom I hold zero affection or respect, but I really wouldn't and didn't want him to die or become desperately ill. And it kind of felt inevitable to me that if you're still adopting that, for the purposes of this conversation, that very English public school position that you can argue or fight your way out of any problem, then it could end up being profoundly dangerous for him. And those were the kind of the three strands that began to come together at the beginning of lockdown. And possibly because of the isolation of lockdown, it became a much more introspective and contemplative book than I was intending, or indeed my publishers had paid for. But I think it works. I hope it works, because as I wrote it, I realized that these experiences that we all have in our childhood, that we respond to in a resistant fashion. So rather than admit pain, we convince ourselves that pain doesn't exist. And once you've done that for yourself, it robs you of empathy, or it dilutes your capacity for empathy. The kind of schools that I went to, and actually John Micklethwaite went to the same school, although I hope he doesn't mind me saying 10 years previously. We went to a school called Ampleforth. Johnson and Cameron went to a school called Eton. They are both extremely rarefied and privileged institutions. And in a sense, they both built upon a tradition of preparing young, again, to pick up on Naomi's point, white European privileged men. It prepared us to go out and run the empire, and the skills you needed to go out and run the empire, I think involved a diminishment of empathy and a diminishment of compassion. I'd always thought of myself as a very empathetic and compassionate person, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had almost brainwashed myself into becoming a bruiser, a verbal bruiser. So then my career began to unfold, and I could have a stand-up row in a newspaper office. Again, you know, it was something I thought was an attribute, I thought was a skill. And I need to be clear that this kind of personality does get you places. It does deliver success. It does get Boris Johnson and David Cameron into Downing Street. It does deliver, you know, whatever success you get by being someone people are frightened to challenge, as opposed to who and where you would be if you were accommodating and constantly kind. But it wasn't making me happy. And what I thought was the trade-off was this: I presumed that the price you paid for the dizzying highs were the dismal lows. I thought that was the only way to live. And crucially, I thought that was me. So to steer it back to therapy, my therapist said to me at the first or second meeting that if we decide to work together, and if this stuff actually pans out, then I will expect you to write to your old teachers, especially the one that used to beat you, and I'd expect you to talk to your 10-year-old self. I thought she was absolutely batty. I thought that was the daftest, most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard in my life, but I was desperate. And so I was, in a sense, going along with it. The parallel I draw in the book is I once met somebody who swore blind about the benefits of coffee enemas. And I was in such a dire situation at the time, domestically, that if I'd thought that a coffee enema might have made me more help to my loved ones, then I probably would have tried that. So therapy seemed, in comparison, quite an easy and straightforward option. I was not expecting this to happen. When she said, "Of course, did it really not hurt you being beaten at such a young age?" And for the first time in my life, I paused and thought and realized, yes, it really had. It really, really had. It really hurt. And I had been frightened. And when I went on to public school, I had been lonely, and I had been scared, and I had been intimidated. And I'd spent every year since creating a false but effective personality that was fearless and full of fight and strong, and other people thought I was. And somewhere deep inside, I must have known I wasn't, but it was working so well. Why would I examine it? Why would I bother trying to unpick it? And so as I realized and said to her, actually, yeah, it really bloody hurt. It really hurt. And it was wrong. I was 10. She said, why don't you talk to him now? And I just did the most natural thing in the world. I started talking to a cushion on a sofa in a garden studio in West London, as if it was my 10-year-old self. Something that as a I cut my teeth on Fleet Street, I'd have laughed my socks off even 6 months previously at the very prospect of doing that. And somehow everything changed. Not immediately, it's not Paul on the road to Damascus, but pretty quickly, the way I looked at the world, the way I felt about myself began to change. So I realized that, having written one book about how other people end up being wrong and proving why they're wrong, and showing the fascinating interplay between evidence and conviction, I thought, well, why don't I use myself? Why don't I really look at why I think what I think about all of the issues where I've hurt people? So I used to be very adept at fat shaming. I'm a radio phone-in host. That's my day job. So it probably won't come as a huge surprise that I used to do performative cruelty quite well. And I used to think, as a great, wonderful, paid-up member of the liberal elite, that I wasn't prejudiced or bigoted or cruel. But the way I spoke about overweight people was just as vicious as the way Donald Trump talks about Muslims or Mexicans. And I couldn't believe it when I listened back to the tapes. And so I thought, let's go all in. Let's write a book about how you ended up holding these ridiculous positions on anything from obesity to marriage to tattoos even, and work out where it came from. And it was an absolutely astonishing and cathartic experience. There's a couple of chapters in which I essentially treat myself like a caller to my own show. Perhaps the best example of that is marriage. I used to be, despite being a bit of a liberal, I used to be very much, I used to sound like Ian Duncan Smith. I used to sound like a Victorian when I talked about marriage. Digging into that, it turned out that my offensive wrongness was linked inextricably to the fact that I was adopted as a child. And so while the other three speakers we've heard this evening are the grown-ups and are looking at the big tides and looking at the global impact of not recognizing wrongness, of believing things that are untrue, whether it's scientific or political or personal. My book, How Not to Be Wrong, I hope, and the early signs are good, will help anybody from whatever background they may be dig into the reasons why they've ended up wedded, I mean, absolutely stuck in places that crucially don't just hurt the people around them or the people that their prejudices are directed at, but ultimately they really hurt ourselves. These are positions that hurt ourselves. And that is why I think it might be a book that you either read yourself in the hope of coming to a better understanding of why you've ended up down some dark holes, or you could possibly give it to someone who you think might need the sort of help I've just described. Thank you.